Story 1. This all went down just last week, right before I had to go back to college. I've been going back and forth about sharing this, but I can't get it out of my head. What if something terrible is happening at my house right now? My mom and dad just moved after I finished high school. They'd been talking about getting a smaller place for years. Once I was ready for college, they finally did it. Since the timing was so close, I'd only visited their new house a few times. When they first bought the place, my parents showed me around and explained all the weird things about living in an old house. One thing they made really clear was that there was no basement underneath, just a small crawl space for pipes and stuff. They seemed totally sure about this, so I never questioned it. My parents left the night before for a week-long trip, leaving me alone in the house. The first weird thing happened on a Tuesday night. I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard this steady tapping noise coming from right under the floor. The tapping kept the same beat and volume the whole time. At first, I thought maybe it was the heater or old pipes making noise, but it just wouldn't stop. That made me worry. I should mention that my bedroom is on the first floor, so these sounds were definitely coming from underground. I got up and walked around trying to figure out exactly where the noise was coming from, but it seemed like it was everywhere under the floor. What really freaked me out was that my parents said there was nothing down there but a tiny crawl space. The thought of hearing noises from below ground, when there wasn't supposed to be any real space down there, was seriously creepy. Finally, the tapping stopped, and I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I figured that would be it. Probably just old house noises, or maybe a raccoon in the crawl space. Boy, was I wrong. The next night, around the same time, that tapping started up again, but this time it was much louder. I tried to ignore it and went to sleep, but I felt way more scared than the first night. When it happened a third night in a row, I knew something was really wrong. That third night was much worse. Instead of just tapping, I heard dragging and scratching sounds too, like some kind of wild animal scraping its claws on something and pulling things around. That's the best way I can explain what I was hearing. I kept trying to make sense of what I was hearing, based on what I knew about the house. Part of my brain kept saying there had to be a normal reason, but I couldn't think of one. The sounds were too clear and too deliberate to brush off as regular house noises anymore. I started wondering if maybe my parents were wrong about the basement, or if there was some kind of access door I didn't know about. Either way, it was terrifying sitting in that dark room with nothing but scraping and tapping sounds for company. The next morning, I called my parents and told them what had been happening. My dad right away told me to check the crawl space for animals. He was worried that maybe something had gotten in there that shouldn't be there. I really didn't want to go down there, but I didn't have much choice. The crawl space door is right under the front porch, so I had to crawl on my hands and knees to check it out properly. Even though I was holding my breath the whole time, scared of what I'd find, there was absolutely nothing down there. Not even any animal. My dad seemed happy with that answer and told me to stop worrying about it. But I wasn't satisfied, and honestly felt pretty frustrated with not having any real answers. I decided to look for other possible reasons. Maybe there was some kind of outside entrance I'd missed, or signs of animals getting in somewhere else. As I walked around the house, I noticed a pile of old building stuff leaning against the side wall. Wood planks, plastic sheets, concrete blocks, things like that. They looked like they'd been sitting there for ages, maybe leftovers from some old repair job. It's not like I'd never seen this stuff before. I just never paid attention to it since I never had a reason to. I started moving the materials around, thinking maybe they were hiding some kind of opening that animals could use to get under the house. What I found instead was so much worse. Hidden behind all the construction junk was a storm door that had been completely covered up. It was partly painted over and clearly hadn't been used in forever, but it was definitely a real entrance. I opened it and found concrete steps going down into what was obviously a basement. I just stood there in complete shock. My parents had been totally wrong about the house not having one. I didn't want to go down there. I really didn't. But I did it anyway. In the short time I was down there, I figured out two horrible things. Someone had definitely been living in that basement, which I could tell from all the empty food containers everywhere. And two, whoever had been living down there wasn't just some normal homeless person, which I could tell from the weird markings carved into the wooden support beams. There were scratch marks that looked like someone keeping count on one beam, with what looked like evil drawings on another. Pictures of people and animals, but drawn in a seriously messed up way. Stuff I don't want to describe here. I didn't stay down there any longer than I absolutely had to. It was and still is the scariest thing I've ever seen. I immediately called my parents to tell them what I'd discovered. They were completely stunned and said they had no clue there was a basement, let alone that someone had been living in it. My dad asked me over and over if I was sure no one was currently down there. I promised him there wasn't. Then he said they'd end their vacation early and come home right away. The first thing I did after hanging up was drive out and buy a heavy-duty lock. I secured the storm door from the outside, thinking that would fix the problem and keep whoever had been staying there from getting back in. That same night I woke up to aggressive banging and rattling coming from outside. I knew instantly what it was. Someone was trying to get back into the basement and was clearly angry that the door was now locked. The banging was so loud and violent that I was afraid they might actually break the door down. I remember just freezing up as my heart started pounding. I couldn't move at all. The banging stopped, and that snapped me out of it. I crept over to the window and looked out just in time to see a dark figure running across the backyard into the night. I couldn't make out any details about who it was, but seeing them run away made the whole thing feel more real and dangerous. The rest of that night was kind of a blur, honestly, mostly because I was so scared and shaken up, as much as I hate to admit it. The police searched the whole house, including the basement, but obviously found nothing. They couldn't do much beyond promising to drive by more often. My parents came home the next day and insisted that everything would be okay now that they were back. They said they'd figure out a better solution together and that I shouldn't worry anymore. I left for college the next morning as planned, but I was and still am extremely bothered by the whole thing. It felt wrong to leave my parents there alone, especially since we have no idea who this person is, who has literally been living in our house for who knows how long. It's only been a few days since I left, and I've been anxiously waiting to hear from my parents about whether anything else has happened. So far, nothing has, but that hasn't made me feel any better. I can't stop thinking about those awful markings I found in the basement, especially those sick drawings. I can't even begin to imagine what that person was doing down there. If I'm being honest, I'm really scared that something else is going to happen. Story 2. I grew up in a small town a few miles from where Montana meets Idaho. I was on the Montana side. Nothing much ever happens around here, and honestly, that's part of why I never moved away. This happened a really long time ago, before everyone had cell phones and was always online. To be honest, my area hasn't changed much since then, which is part of why what I'm about to tell you is still so clear in my memory. It was the very end of August, one of those last days of summer when you can already feel fall coming. That morning I was driving my usual route to work, just a 2-lane road that goes through farmland and small hills. About 15 minutes into my drive, I saw a car pulled over on the side of the road. It was a light blue older car, and it looked like it had been sitting there for a while. It was just parked there on the shoulder, no emergency lights flashing, no one standing around, just sitting there angled slightly toward the ditch. Now listen, I'm not stupid, but I am the kind of person who helps people in trouble. That's just how my parents raised me. As I got closer, I slowed down to get a better look. The car wasn't running, and I couldn't see anyone inside. No one in the front seat, back seat, anywhere. It was definitely weird, especially that early in the morning, but it wasn't exactly scary. People break down and walk off looking for help all the time out here. I figured maybe someone had car trouble and walked to the nearest farm for help, so I kept driving. I had to get to work, and it didn't seem like an emergency. Honestly, I pretty much forgot about the whole thing by the time I got off work. But as I was driving home, I saw that exact same car again in the exact same spot. The only difference was that this time, the driver's door was wide open, It definitely hadn't been like that in the morning. I was sure of it. I slowed down again, stretching my neck to see as I passed, but there was still no sign of anyone. No one walking around. No footprints I could see, just that same old car sitting there with a door hanging open like someone jumped out in a hurry and never came back. This time I didn't just shrug it off. I pulled over once I got cell service again and called the non-emergency police number. I told the person who answered where I was and what I'd seen, and she thanked me and said someone would go check it out. When I drove to work the next day, the car was finally gone, so I figured that would be the end of it. About a week later though, while I was eating breakfast, I saw something on the local news that got my attention. The police were apparently investigating a missing person case, something about a car found abandoned along a country road just outside town. The things they were saying matched exactly with what I had seen. I instantly put the pieces together and turned up the TV volume. They didn't say the guy's name, but they said the car belonged to a man from out of town who never showed up where he was supposed to be. The thing was, according to the police, there was no sign of anything bad happening, and no witnesses to what occurred. I've always been a little suspicious of news reports, so I wasn't sure I believed the story they were telling. Either way, it was creepy that I had basically witnessed the situation right when it happened. Come to think of it, I might have been the first person, or even the only person to have reported that car on the roadside at all. It was definitely a strange feeling. I tried to move on with my life, but I just couldn't. The curiosity was eating it. Like I said before, not much happens around here, so something as weird as this was way too strange for me to just ignore. The next morning, I called up my brother. I'll just call him Benjamin. He's a local firefighter, not in my exact town, but close enough that we usually hear about the same things. That's just kind of how it works in my part of the country. I wanted to ask him if he had any information from the police, because I knew they often share information with each other. He told me they'd gotten some notice about it from the sheriff's office. Something about a car found abandoned, and obviously the missing person. I asked him if the police were planning to do anything about it. He said he didn't know for sure, but that they'd probably put together a search team at some point. He didn't have many details beyond that. I told him we should help out, and maybe see if a few of the guys from his fire station would be willing to join too. At first he was confused about why I cared so much about the whole thing, but I eventually talked him into it, and honestly I'm not really sure why I was so determined about it either. I guess I just felt like I had some personal connection to it. I didn't even know how we'd work with the police and organize the search, so I let my brother handle all of that. Within a couple of days, and with permission of course, he put something together. The police were already planning a search, and they were grateful for the extra help. It wasn't anything huge, just a few officers, some off-duty firefighters, and me. The search focused on a shallow wooded area, and a couple of old water ditches that ran just off the shoulder of the highway. It was the kind of landscape that wouldn't look like much from a passing car, but once you were walking through it, it was clear how easy it would be for someone to get lost or disappear from view. We split into pairs to cover more ground efficiently. I obviously paired up with my brother. About an hour into the search, one of the pairs radioed in. They'd spotted something through a gap in the bushes. We all headed to their location as fast as we could. It turned out to be an old maintenance building, and from the looks of it, one that probably hadn't been used in years. The whole thing was half buried in the ground, with plants growing up the sides. From the road you'd never even know it was there. The door was hanging slightly open, and I could see that the lock had been broken off. Inside it was dark and musty, the way you'd expect an abandoned place to smell. But as my eyes got used to the darkness, I started noticing signs that someone had been there recently. There were empty water bottles and food wrappers scattered around in a way that seemed intentional. The search team spread out to look for more evidence, both inside and around the outside of the building. One of the firefighters said he'd found something by the back wall, so the rest of us went over to see what it was. There was a small neat hole in one of the wooden boards, just above floor level. The hole had sharp, jagged edges that looked nothing like the kind of damage you'd expect from weather or decay. It looked exactly like a bullet hole. We searched carefully both inside the building and around it, looking for a bullet casing, a bullet, or any signs of blood. But there was nothing, just that single unexplained hole in the wall that didn't make sense, given the complete lack of other evidence. The officers radioed the discovery to their headquarters, and I could tell from their voices that this had become more than just a simple missing person case. The lead officer gathered all of us together and said they'd handle it from there. Then he specifically asked me to leave, since I was the only civilian volunteer. I felt brushed off and frustrated, but I didn't have much choice, except to do what he said. So I left. When I called Benjamin later that evening, he gave me vague answers about what had happened after I was gone. Eventually he admitted that the firefighters had also been asked to leave shortly after I did. The police had basically cleared everyone out and taken over the scene completely. Over the next few weeks, I waited for Benjamin's contacts at the police department claimed they didn't know any details about the case, which I found odd. The local news never followed up beyond the original missing person report. It was like the whole thing had just been quietly dropped. Eventually I decided to drive back and find the building on my own. I was certain I remembered exactly where it was. So one day I drove along the highway until I found the spot where we had started the search. I spent hours walking the area where I was absolutely sure the building should be. I followed the water ditches perfectly. Everything from the landscape to the view looked exactly the same as it had that day, but there was nothing, no building anywhere. I started questioning my own memory. I figured there was a small chance that maybe I wasn't looking in the exact right spot, but even if that were true, the building should have been somewhere in that general area. I tried a different section of the search zone, then another, but still found nothing. It was so strange, stranger than I'm making it sound now. I remember standing there in that overgrown wilderness, completely alone, except for the gentle wind that blew past me every now and then. Peaceful, yes, but strange. The only other explanation I could think of was that maybe the county had removed the building entirely. It wouldn't have been too hard to dig the thing up and haul it away, but that seemed like an extreme response to what was supposed to be a routine missing person case. Those were the only two possibilities though. Either my memory had failed me, or the building was no longer. I left shortly after that. There wasn't much else I could do really. I was left with this uncomfortable feeling that something important had happened during those final days of summer. Something I was briefly allowed to see before being shut out completely. Every year when August ends, and I feel that familiar change in the air, I think about that abandoned car, and that bullet hole in the wall of a building that may or may not have even existed. Story 3. This happened last August, and it's completely changed how I feel about camping alone. When I was a kid, my dad had this end of summer tradition where he'd take me and my brother on a camping trip sometime around mid-August. Nothing fancy, just a few days in the wilderness to mark the end of summer before school started again. I'm in my late 20s now with a serious girlfriend, and I've moved on with my life in most ways. But that end of summer camping tradition is something I've tried to keep going. Sometimes I can convince my dad and brother to come with me, but usually it's just me going alone because my girlfriend absolutely hates camping. I don't want to drag her somewhere she'll be miserable for 3 days, so I've gotten used to the solitude. For this particular trip, I'd found what looked like a perfect spot on Google Maps, some random isolated clearing that wasn't an official campsite or anything like that. It was far enough away from any roads or trails that I figured I'd have complete privacy for a few days. I liked the idea of actually being alone out there, not surrounded by RVs and families with screaming kids, like at the official campsites. I downloaded the map so I'd be able to use it without cell service, something I always make sure to do. The hike-in took about 2 hours. I'm in decent shape, but I was carrying all my gear, so I took my time. I hiked until I found a good place to set up my tent. It was pretty much exactly what I'd been hoping for, a nice flat area, surrounded by thick pine trees, with a little clearing that gave me a good view of the sky. That first night was perfect. Honestly, just me, my thoughts, and nobody asking me about work or when I was getting married or any of that stuff. I made a small fire, cooked some freeze-dried pasta that actually wasn't half bad, and spent time looking at the stars. The next morning, I decided to hike to a nearby river I'd seen on my map. I figured I'd try to catch a fish for dinner. It would feel more real than just eating the packaged food I brought for the whole trip. Plus it would kill some time, and out there you've got nothing but time. I basically spent the whole day at the river, but I didn't mind. It was nice and peaceful, and even though I'm not much of a fisherman, I got lucky and actually caught a decent-sized brook trout. I threw it in my portable cooler and started making my way back to camp. I was feeling pretty good about myself. My dad would have been proud.
The problem was that I'd completely messed up the timing of sunset and underestimated how far I'd hike. What should have been a relaxed walk back to my campsite turned into a trek through the woods after the sun had already gone down. Within maybe 20 minutes, it went from that golden evening light to basically complete darkness. I had a headlamp, but the terrain was unfamiliar enough that I was moving pretty slowly. At one point I noticed a faint light in the distance. It appeared to be swaying back and forth in this steady pattern, like someone was walking with a lantern or flashlight. At first I was actually relieved. Maybe there was another camper out there. We could help each other find our way back to wherever we were supposed to be. After all, if you're hiking through thick wilderness at that time of night, you've definitely messed something up, or mistimed something, just like I had. As I watched the light, I realized it was getting closer to me, meaning whoever was holding it was walking in my direction. Not wanting to scare them, I decided to let them know I was there, and yelled out a friendly hello, followed by asking if they were camping too. I kept my voice as friendly and non-threatening as possible. The light immediately stopped moving. I watched as it stayed perfectly still for several seconds, which struck me as odd. Then, without warning, it shut off completely, which struck me as even strange. Another few seconds passed, and I stared at the now pitch-black spot where the light had just been. And then, out of nowhere, I heard this violent crashing through the brush, like someone running full speed through the forest, but not toward or away from me, off to the left, sideways to where I was standing. It was unmistakable. My heart was beating pretty hard at that point. The whole thing was really disturbing. I can't even begin to describe how uncomfortable I felt. Everything about it was just so wrong. Why would someone run away like that? Even if I'd startled them, the normal reaction would be to say something back, or at the very least, back away slowly, not sprint through the woods in complete darkness. I tried to rationalize it the whole way back to my campsite. The best explanation I could come up with was that I had somehow scared them by calling out. After all, they had no way of knowing that I meant no harm, and running into a stranger in the middle of nowhere at night could be frightening for anyone. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The isolated nature of the area made it unlikely that there would be other campers around, and most people would at least respond when someone called out to them, especially in a friendly way. I picked up the pace and made it back to my campsite, but I was so unsettled that I didn't even bother making a fire to cook the fish. I just sat in my tent, ate some of my packed food, and tried to read my book before calling it an early night. I'm normally a pretty heavy sleeper, especially when I'm camping and exhausted from hiking all day. So when I woke up randomly in the middle of the night, I knew something was wrong. I listened to my surroundings for a few minutes, but everything sounded normal, just the usual forest noises you'd expect. Before trying to go back to sleep, I realized I needed to step outside to relieve myself. I unzipped my tent and started to poke my head out. The moon was pretty bright, enough that I could see the clearing without my headlamp. The moment I got a clear view of my campsite, I froze completely. There was someone standing there, maybe 15 feet from my tent. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of a person where there absolutely should not have been a person. They were just standing there without moving, like they were watching my tent. I'd never been in a situation like that before, and I honestly had no idea what to do. My mind was racing, but my body wouldn't move. Surely, whoever was there had seen or heard me unzip the tent, and they probably knew that I was now aware they were standing there. I was likely moments away from being attacked. As soon as I started thinking in terms of life and death, my survival instinct kicked in, and I was able to snap myself out of my frozen state. I reached for the switchblade I always kept by the entrance of my tent, and called out loudly, asking who was there. The moment I spoke, the figure started running directly toward my tent, catching me completely off guard. No warning, just 0 to full sprint instantly, like screaming in this shrill, unnatural way that didn't even sound human. They hit me before I could even process what was happening. The two of us started rolling around on the ground, and the guy, definitely a man judging by the voice, began clawing at my face like an animal. Not punching, literally clawing like he was trying to tear me apart. I managed to get the switchblade between us, and sliced at his hand, before dropping it in the struggle. Even though I hadn't gotten the cleanest cut, slicing his hand was apparently enough, because he immediately started shrieking and got off me. He went crashing through the woods again. Only this time, I could hear him screaming or laughing, or making whatever sick noise he was making. I sat there for who knows how long trying to process what had just happened. My face was stinging from the scratches and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I could feel blood all over my face, but I wasn't sure if it was mine or his. I considered trying to hike back to my car immediately, but navigating through the woods in pitch black darkness seemed like an even worse idea than staying put. I only really had one option at that point: spend the rest of the night sitting in my tent, switchblade in hand, listening to every little sound and expecting the man to come back at any moment. It was the longest night of my life, but I eventually made it to daylight. The second there was enough light to see, I packed up my gear as quietly as possible and hiked back to my car at a significantly faster pace than I had been going on the way in. As soon as I got to my car, I sped out of there without another thought. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Some guy attacked me in the woods where I was camping illegally. They probably would have just told me that's what I get for camping alone in remote spots. So I did. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about how close I'd come to something really bad happening. If I hadn't had that knife, or if the guy hadn't run off when I cut him, things could have ended very differently. But that's not even the craziest part. The thing that still makes my head spin is just the fact that he was even there. Like, he obviously wasn't camping, and he obviously wasn't a normal person. That much was clear from the fact that he tracked me down in pitch black darkness, then attacked. And that scream, it honestly gives me chills just thinking about how brutal it was. Definitely human, but twisted in some truly unnatural way. I haven't been solo camping since then, and I'm not sure I ever will again.